Hey guys, I'm starting to do some work on my C.A. Earl Tombstone cabinet. This radio must have sat in a basement in about an inch of water at some point. It's not too bad, but definitely the lower inch or so got a bit warped. So what we got here on the sides is some basic veneer separation there and here. And that's fairly easy to fix, as I'll show you. This is the worst part. This is like an early type of plywood, and these layers are completely delaminated and they harden that way. So what I'm attempting to do is to soak this in water. Got a little dish here, got a brush, and I'm just gradually soaking this in. And my hope is that when it gets flexible enough, I can use a clamp, some boards, and then squirt some glue into those seams and squeeze this back together. Now it is the back of the radio, so even if it cracks, no big deal, hardly visible. These sides though are a bit more visible, so what I'm doing here is I soak this in a bit of water and then fed in some diluted glue, and now I'm simply going to put some wax paper against the side and then a board, because I don't want to damage the side here, and then just use a C-clamp and let it set up for an hour or two, and then do the same on the other side. This side has set up nicely, nice and smooth now, nice and strong. I've been soaking this base for a couple hours, and as you can see, it's nice and flexible, and as it's soaked in, it's actually closed up a bit, so that's good. Now I'm going to take this 2x4, which is just the right length to fit in the cabinet here, take a bunch of C-clamps, flood this with glue, and start cranking this down and see if I can get it to become flat again. This is actually working out quite well. I've never tackled wood that was this warped or this badly separated before. So what I've got here is a 2x4, piece of wax paper to prevent the wood from getting glued to the other piece of wood. Same on the other side, and then 3 C-clamps. The outer two are tightened down quite tight. The center one I'm slowly tightening to avoid splitting the wood, and I've got this pretty darn flat and straight. I thought there would end up being some bow in it, but this is looking good. As I tighten this down, glue is oozing out of the seams. It's a real good idea to take a damp sponge and to mop up the glue. It's much easier to get it off at this stage, and after it's hardened and you need to sand and scrape it off. I'm going to continue slowly tightening these clamps, and then because I soak this so much with water, it's going to take a long time to dry out. So I'm going to let it sit overnight. I'll resume recording tomorrow and show you how it turned out. Here we are the next afternoon. I just removed the clamps, and it's looking pretty good. It's certainly pulled back together tight and set up. Slightly wavy, but I'm fine with it. Much better than it was before. So I'm going to move on to this side, which is a little bit of veneer separation just along the bottom, all along the side here. So more diluted glue and more clamping. It turns out this center panel was just held in by 8 screws. I removed them and gave it a bit of a whack to pop the glue loose, and it came right out, which made it a lot easier to work with. So I then proceeded to strip it and sand it, and now I'm ready to start refinishing it. I also stripped the rest of the cabinet down, as you can see. This makes things a lot easier because now I don't have to mask anything. The center panel is going to be a light walnut, and the rest of the cabinet will be a very dark walnut to obscure the fact that these are some different woods and grains. It should be almost black, almost like a paint more than a stain. So the next step I want to do on this is to take some black paint and paint in around all the, I guess you call it fretwork. Eventually there'll be new grill cloth that goes behind here, and because this is a plywood, I really don't want to just leave this like that is. I really want to darken that up so it's not apparent that it's plywood. Once that's dry, I will go over the whole thing with some shellac to seal it. Shellac is good for going over old refinished items because it will seal in just about anything. So any traces of old glue, finish, stripper residue, this black paint will all get coated and sealed underneath this. Then I can move on to the lacquers. I've got these three in particular: medium brown walnut, extra dark walnut, and dark walnut. I'm going to try the medium brown walnut on the center panel and then one of the other two on the sides. I've never used any of these before, so I'm not sure how light or how dark they may be, so I'll need to do some tests first. While stripping down the center panel, I noticed something else. I already knew that somebody added in the eye tube, that was pretty apparent. But what I wasn't expecting is that this C.A. Earl radio escutcheon also appears to be a later add-on, because behind it was a crudely cut out hole, just like the one above it, where it looks like somebody took a drill and plunged in many times around the sides and then popped it out and then maybe filed it, which made it for a crude opening, so this was actually packed with a lot of wood filler behind and then secured on. So I've still been searching around online. I still have not identified any or exactly what this is, but now I have a pretty good feeling that this escutcheon did not go with this radio, nor did the chassis, nor did the speaker. So a little bit hard to find any info on it. I was able to search going by the 5-tube lineup that was marked on the chassis, and it turned out that was a pretty unique combination of tubes. I only found 3 or 4 chassis that match it. I have the schematics for each of those, and I will print them out and compare it to what I've got. Hopefully one of them matches pretty close, so I've got some sort of blueprint to work off of to store the chassis. In the meantime, though, I'm going to keep working on the cabinet. The front's coming along nicely. I painted in those edges with the black acrylic, then clear coated with shellac, and then the lacquer sanding sealer. One thing I wanted to really mention was that if I had just used lacquer over acrylic, it probably would have turned into a bubbling, gooey mess, because lacquer really doesn't play well with a lot of other paints like enamel and acrylic. But since shellac will coat and seal darn near anything, no problems whatsoever. So now a few rounds of sanding, I think, to get the surface a bit smoother, and then move on to the toner lacquer. I went through a few rounds on the center panel of the sanding lacquer, then sanding, then more sanding lacquer, then more sanding, until I got all the pores completely filled in and a nice smooth surface. Now I've just given it a couple quick coats of this Mohawk Ultra Classic medium brown toning lacquer. This stuff is fantastic. In case you're ever wondering why you would use toning lacquer versus staining, well, in about 60 seconds I was able to get this to the final color that I want, this nice brown walnut. I could have used stain, but then I would have to wait upwards of 72 hours for it to completely dry before I could move on to clear coating. But using this, in a few minutes I'll be able to move on to the clear coat. So basically in one day I was able to strip this, seal it, sand it, fill in all the grain, tone it, and then I'll put on a few clear coats, and basically in about 24 hours I'll have this thing refinished. Now that the center panel's done, I can move on to the rest of the cabinet. The original finish was pretty bad when I got it, so it was a little hard for me to tell what the original colors were. And of course I can't find any examples online of this radio, so I figured I'd take a little artistic license with the color scheme. So, center panel was medium walnut, which was pretty close to the original. That portion I was able to figure out. But for the rest of it, well, I found a few different colors as I was stripping it. There seemed to be a dark green, and then some brown, and maybe a couple different shades of brown. So what I'm going to do is, for this top center panel and the bottom trim along the bottom, I'm going to use dark walnut. Then I'll mask those off and do the sides and the fluting with extra dark walnut. I think that'll be a pretty good color combination. I've seen some other tombstones from other manufacturers, and it was pretty common for the main sides to be really dark, like the Philco 643 tombstone I have uses extra dark walnut on the sides and the top, so I don't think I'm deviating too much from what the original colors probably were. So I have a little bit more masking to do, and then more spraying. Here we are about a week later, and I have finished refinishing the cabinet. It came out quite nicely, I think. To recap, I used extra dark walnut toning lacquer on the sides, the dark walnut toning lacquer on the top center, and medium walnut toning lacquer on the center board. And then several coats of clear gloss lacquer over the entire cabinet. Now what's left to do is replace the old rotting grill cloth, which I removed, and then of course get the radio to work. I did spend some time and try to trace out the wiring. The power supply and audio output were fairly straightforward, but when it came to the RF and IF stages, the modifications were confusing, and I couldn't see the internal wiring of the IF cans without dismantling them, which I really don't want to do. So I couldn't quite figure it all out, but in my review I did determine that the wiring was pretty sound. I didn't find any shorts to ground. The power transformers seemed alright. I also spent some time lubricating all the rusted seized up controls, and the switches and the controls are all working quite nicely now. So my plan is to carefully recap the set and hook it up with a dim bulb tester and slowly power it up and see what happens. I probably won't get to it for a while though, because I want to cram as much refinishing as possible before the weather gets too cold. It's it's mid-September now, and I've probably only got like another 6 to 8 weeks before it just gets too cold for me to do any spray lacquer. And I've got a bunch of stuff to refinish, so this will just have to wait. But in the meantime, I think I've got a nice display piece to show off. I hope you enjoyed this video on refinishing a vintage Tombstone radio cabinet.